Hello and welcome to the GoodPractice Podcast, a weekly show about work, performance and learning. I'm Dickie, and this week we're welcoming the CIPD's Andy Lancaster back to the show. Earlier this year, Andy appeared on episode 150 live from London and revealed that he was writing a book. Now, he's written that book, Driving Performance Through Learning. So we thought we'd invite him back to chat about what it covers, and looking at its contents page, it covers quite a lot. So this is everything you always wanted to know about effective workplace learning, but were afraid to ask. Welcome back to the show, Andy.
Brilliant, and thank you for the opportunity to come and chat about this something that's occupied my life for about the last 9 months. Not my daytime, this has been the evenings and the weekends, but good to come and talk about it.
And we're also joined, as usual, by a regular contributor, Owen Ferguson. Hello, Owen.
Hello, Ross.
So, Andy, the book is basically a holistic guide to the conversations going on around the future of workplace learning. We've got performance consulting, tracking impact, responsive design, digital learning, facilitating social learning communities, coaching, and L&D team transformation. What prompted you to write this book, and why did you decide to cover quite such a broad field?
So I guess when you start looking at this, we are now, as learning practitioners, having to weave together a whole range of strands. So I think in planning the book, there was a simple question which kind of fired me up in the first place. What can we practically do to support the transformation of organisational learning, particularly to support performance improvement? So I think it needed that broad spectrum because there are so many elements which we as learning practitioners need to consider now as part of our kind of learning mix. And I think there is a real challenge for us right now about what this looks like. There's lots of conversations going on, but the research evidence would show that L&D practice is at best stalled, or in many cases we're beginning to see that it's actually stagnating or going backwards. So we've got this challenge about this new world of learning, what it looks like, but how do we progress into it? So for me, it was answering that question. And as I scoped it out, it was really just trying to have a holistic approach as to what does learning look like now if we want to drive it into the heart of the organisation. And one other interesting thing, when I first presented the title and spoke about the title at a conference, someone actually challenged me as to whether performance should be in the title, whether that was appropriate or risky. And that took me aback for a moment, because if in organisations we're not linking learning to the actual goals of the organisation, then what are we doing? And I guess the sense was, isn't this about lifelong learning and wider stuff beyond the organisation? Yeah, sure it is, but we have to really understand that with huge resources going into organisational learning, this really has to support performance. So that was a kind of the premise of where it got to, why it covered such a broad range of topics.
Because without performance in the title, it would just be driving through learning, which is kind of partly what you're really against, isn't it, in the book?
It is, yeah. And one of my buddies on social media this week actually said, is this about how to drive your car faster? Because it's driving performance through learning. So I had to correct him on this one. But no, you're absolutely right. It has to. Yeah, we have to get to the place where the added value that we can bring to organisations is core to our thinking. And sadly, as we often know, sometimes it's a secondary thing that we're running all this stuff, but are we actually supporting the organisation to be brilliant?
So the key underpinning shift in the book is the importance of learning being delivered in the flow of work as opposed to through formal courses. So what do you see as driving that change?
Yes, so I mean, CIPD, we use three lenses to look at how change is going on, and these are helpful hooks, I think. So one is how work is changing, one's how the workforce is changing, and how the workplace is changing. And I think for practitioners, that's a really great way to stand back and reflect about how learning is changing. So on some of those kind of things, we know work is changing massively. Operational models are changing. We know that the day of the long-term plan now is gone because we need to be more responsive and agile. Technology particularly is changing work. But then we think about workforce. We have, as we know, many generations who have different needs. Let's not get into kind of millennial stereotypes, but we have a range of folks in the workforce, and people who have flexible working and part-time working and home working. So the kind of the way that the workforce is kind of composed now makes the old traditional let's go on a course in a room very difficult. And I think now workplaces, again, we're seeing all manner of changes, particularly around designing great workplaces. We're not fixed at desks anymore. We have more collaborative working, all those kind of things. So I think for me, and I use the word addiction to the course, I think that needs to be said, that in many contexts we are addicted, and our immediate response is when we look at workplace learning, we're going to put a course on. And I guess what this book does is it looks at how do you design responsive learning solutions? How do you consider the wider organizational ecosystem? How do you get people collaborating and working together to learn? What about technology and high-speed internet and all these kind of devices? We want organizations with more sustainable carbon footprint. So why are we shipping people to venues? So I think there was lots of reasons around that. But I think for folks, if you do engage with the book, there's a real underpinning chapter at the beginning which looks at work, workforce and workplace and how this is really shifting learning, and now it has to be in the flow of work. Doesn't mean we're not going to do courses, but we have to think about learning in the moment when people really need to access it.
Yeah, it's the what else piece, and I think it's important for learning professionals, or in fact anyone who's going to have an impact on the future direction of an organisation, to hold two competing things in their head at the same time. That one is that the context in which people are working is changing, right? The access to technology, the nature of people's work patterns, the opportunities that are there, that is all changing. But at the same time, people are fundamentally the same biologically as they have been for generations.
Yep.
So how do you marry those two sort of, competing things in your head? That things are, at the one hand, changing rapidly, and on the other hand, not changing at all in any appreciable way. And that is a real challenge for learning and development. We need to be able to look at our practices and look at the things that we have done simply because there's not been an alternative, and then look at the opportunities that are there for us now because things have changed fundamentally.
Yep. And I think that's right. And I think it's like social collaborative learning. We look at this as though this is some wonderful new thing that suddenly appeared, and we know that this is, historically, this is the way that communities shared learning and knowledge and practice, and we know that kids naturally learn this way. And it makes me smile because sometimes we think we're incredibly trendy if we have learning or business meetings in coffee shops, and then we go back and we realize that coffee shops in past eras were the place where business innovation took place. So I think we're rediscovering some of this stuff, but I think the technology and the circumstances are now enabling us to leverage this in a much more effective way. So I think you're absolutely right. People don't change, but the way we can actually now engage in learning, there's huge potential. And I guess that's the heart of the book. How do we leverage this, all these different ways to get learning right in the mix in the daily kind of flow of work?
Yeah, and also to battle the inertia that might exist, that stops us from adopting other ways of learning and working. Because you mentioned the coffee shop, so the sort of classic, 18th, 17th century sort of London cafe culture. You've got Isaac Newton and Hooke and Boyle, all sort of discussing ideas in amongst one another, because people do feed off that human connection. It is a shift and a step for people to start collaborating online digitally. And one of the things that the learning function can do is to help facilitate that. How do you help overcome that inertia? Because in our sort of wider organisation, the number of online meetings that we have, and we've got all the technology and we've got all the connections, but the simple thing of just turning on your webcam, a lot of people don't do it, and it's. How do you provide people with prompts and reasons, and get them to overcome some of the hurdles that make those ways of working less effective?
Yeah, and I think as well, so we put a report together at CIPD earlier this year called Professionalising L&D, and there was one of the things that really captured my attention was the impact of senior leader perceptions on what learning is. And we've kind of got ourselves into this vicious cycle where senior leaders have an expectation that learning is going to look like courses. That's how it is, and the research evidence showed that. But then that puts us in a position where if we haven't got professional courage, we go with that. And then the organisation is saying, well, the learning gang are not very innovative because they're just delivering courses. So we kind of get stuck in this really difficult cycle. So I guess part of the reason for writing the book was not only to support learning practitioners, but the wider debate to say, what does this look like? And I think the compelling vision is really, is what we have to get. And I think that's where we've often lacked it. Why have we not changed? I don't think it's because we don't want to change, but we don't necessarily know what this can look like. And that was really, one of the drivers behind putting the book together.
You touched on this a little bit before we started recording, but how did you we've touched on the fact that the industry as a whole is changing very rapidly and technology is part of what's driving that. How did you approach sort of future-proofing, or not necessarily future-proofing, but just the scope of the book, with the anticipation that things are going to change greatly within the next few years? Yes.
So I think building a vision, it's underpinned by key principles, and I think that's where we have to go to. So it's evidence-based and it's principles-based. So I think for me, I think we've got to go with this, and we've got to take steps into the future, and that requires fresh vision. Now, clearly things are going to change. We know things like artificial intelligence can have a massive impact on learning, but the underpinning principles of how we approach this, I think, don't change. And I think for me, I kind of go back to a really interesting time of career where I worked in substance misuse rehab, an organisation helping people with major substance misuse issues. And a similar kind of question came up. So how does someone change? How do you do that? Well, what you do is you put such a compelling vision together that people want to change. They can see how this goes. So I think for me, in responding to that, there were 4 aspects. I guess there's 4 sections in the book for those who haven't had a chance to look at it yet. So the first one is emerging landscapes. You start by looking at the context. That has to be the place. The technology doesn't come first. The context comes first, and that's sometimes where, as learning practitioners, we get into faddism, where we just jump on the latest fad because we're not thinking about context. I think there are essential foundations, which is section 2, which we have to do, and I think that's things like consulting conversations. We have to get to the point where really poor learning needs analysis is ejected, and we really understand about how to consult and really find out what people need and what the real issues are. And that involves obviously things like tracking impact, responsive design. But then I think that the third section of the book really looks at transformational tactics. And I think this is a tactics issue, that we need to think about the tactics. And right now there are things like digital, social communities, curation, all these kind of things. But in order to make those tactics work, you've got to revisit the learning function, and that's the 4th section. I think you have to look at transforming the L&D function. We need to have different roles, if not job titles, different roles in this. So I guess what I've tried to do is to give a framework there about how do we step back, and then if you put a new technology in, we use the same thing. What's the emerging landscape? What's the context? How are we trying to transform things? And what do we as professionals need to do? So, change is not easy, but I tell you what, if you don't have a compelling vision, it's almost impossible. And I think that's part of what we need to build in. Yeah,
and one of the things that I think you do really well in the book is you layer up that argument almost. You do cover off the organisational context, how the nature of work is changing, and then you do tackle the sort of the fundamentals of L&D. And in that bit, I think you provide enough historical context around looking at, here are the models and techniques and the methods are in the conversation at the moment. I was delighted to see the training cycle covered off briefly, almost as a historical artifact. I remember covering that off in my certificate of training practice 20 years ago. But very quickly move on to, look, these are the ones that should be, that should be on your antenna now. Right? These are the ways of looking at designing responsively, as you call it. These are the ones that you should be considering now, and you're encouraging people to reflect on how well they align with what they're doing at the moment, and whether they need to think about shifting that.
Yeah, and I think this is, how often have we been in situations, change situations ourselves, where scare tactics, it doesn't help you embrace change. What we have to do is to recognise where we are. And for many of us, we've had huge security around things like ADDIE and these models. These have been our history. And I think that the nature of the book is not just to kind of trash this stuff, because this stuff has led us to where we are. And I think what we've now got to do is to have a critical mindset to look at these models and really understand that all models are approximations, as George Box said. These models, and I've thrown some new ones in, they are approximations as well. But what we've got to do is to help people to nudge forward. And I think everything we know around kind of behavioural change often is a nudge process. That's how this happens. So I think to nudge people towards new ways of thinking, new ways of addressing things, is really important. So it's a progression, and we need to help many learning practitioners make that progression to transform learning in their context.
Yeah, I mean, there's models feature quite heavily in the book. If I was somebody starting out in L&D and I had absolutely no idea of any of these models, wasn't familiar with any of them, what would be a good place to start? Should that be built into developing L&D practitioners? Yeah, what do you see as the role of models?
So for me, models frame things for us, and that's what they are. They are approximations, and I've come up with some new ones. I'll chuck them in a moment, but they help us frame things. So I think models are useful because often we're dealing in complex scenarios. So I think a model will allow us to frame the view. That's exactly what it does. So I think we need to be very careful of models, that we don't get into taking them as the absolute default. This is how you do it. But I think they are needed. So, for instance, let's just take evaluation just for a second. Is there anything wrong with Kirkpatrick model? There are issues with the Kirkpatrick model, but there are issues with all evaluation models. But what we've got is we've got a profession who is so tied into one particular model that we don't look laterally and see other things. So I guess what I've tried to do in the book is to say, look wider. There are many other models which could really help us. So I guess on that particular model, what I came up with 15 questions, which have been drawn from a whole range of models. So I think that's what models are for. They help you to frame and to understand and to ask the right questions. So, I think they are important. I think the one which really helped me, my own model helped me, to be honest with you, in sitting there late at night trying to think this one through, was a whole thing around successful social communities. And I came up with 7 things, which when I've gone around and looked, the number of times I've gone into organisations who have said, we've put a social platform, exactly what you said, Owen, we've put it in, no one goes on there. It's, it's just like the most desolate place. And I was in one large organisation, a banking organisation, and it was just brilliant. It wasn't brilliant. It was sad, but it was amusing to hear. And the learning manager literally went back in their chair. So we've put this social learning thing in, and the only people on there are the vegan cookery group. And it's just, I'm not going to make any comments about vegan cookery. But what was interesting, it was just like, what's happened? And I said, you need to go and talk to the vegan cookery group, because they've clearly got the DNA right of why this works for them. So my little model on there, the 7 C's of successful communities, that's based around surfing around organisations and finding out that things like culture, things like having a cause, that's why the vegan cookery group worked, because they had a cause they gathered around. And we have to build the right conditions in. There's cadence, there's rhythm around communities. Best communities are seeded with content, and people contribute. We need to think about working out loud, and the whole thing about giving people credit and valuing. So I guess for me, the models, let's not get stuck on them, but let's use these as windows to say these will help us to have really great tactics around design. So you'll find models in there. And the other thing I think as well for the book, which again scared me a bit, there are quite a few references in chapters. I think one of them has over 70 references, and the reason for that is we need to go and do some reading, and we need to go and get hold of this stuff. So I think models and references, these are underpinning things that we really need to have as part of our practice.
But I think what you provide in the book is a good starting point. You do summarise the sort of the ones that are being considered most widely, and then the references allow people to go off and dive deeper into those. And I think that's important. I mean, sometimes I do find that people become almost, they want to follow a model slavishly. They want something that literally tells them what to do. Whereas I think a better way of thinking about them is that, look, that they're fuel for your thinking. But you need to think about your own context. So if I think about, my actual day job, which is, or a significant part of my actual day job, which is thinking about how do we make digital things well. There's lots of approaches out there, in the sort of the world of software development about how you go about doing that well. But what I've not done is I've not taken one and said, this is the one. This is the one I'm going to use and I'm going to follow, and I'm going to make our organization fit into that model. I think I like the way that they frame that part of it, and I might take a part of this model, this other model, and fit it in here because I think actually it expands on it quite nicely. And then there's some things that I think that we do really well internally that aren't really covered off by any model, and I say I'm going to keep that because I think that's working really well for us. And you construct a way of working. The models inform the thinking, but there is, I can't think of a single way that we do something where we turn around and we essentially say we follow a particular model or method. Absolutely. There is no absolutes. Models are, as you've said, Andy, they're an approximation of reality. And as a result, they're not going to apply in every single context because every organization is different. They've got different needs and they've got different people and skill sets.
Totally agree. So I think, for me, in the book, so for instance, on the performance consulting or consulting conversations, it's crucial for us. There's good stuff. There probably isn't time now, but there's good reasons why learning needs analysis are weak, poor, ineffective. And those are listed in the book. I've done the heavy lifting for us on there in terms of why that is. But on performance, there's a number of performance consulting models which I've put in there. But what was really exciting for me, I managed to distill out 20 absolutely vital questions. So those are not the only ones, but those are 20 great questions to ask. So I think that's exactly right. That's how we need to approach this. And I think models are important, and I think we are in the learning business. We need to help people to be able to reflect and think, and I think in learning we often do that. And I think for ourselves, having some of these models around are really important in our journey as to how we kind of move from an addiction to courses to learning right in the flow of work.
I'd quite like to pick up on your example about the vegan cookery group in the Banky organization, which is sort of an example of a community evolving organically to meet a particular learning need, albeit one that doesn't necessarily help drive performance in the organization. And you write quite a lot in the book about approaches to workplace learning that are effectively outside of the control of traditional L&D. So things like social learning, which the vegan cookery group is an example of, also peer coaching and the use of curated resources. So I guess my question off the back of that is, how does L&D go about creating the conditions where those sorts of things can be useful and help drive performance, but in a way that actually directs it to meet the needs of the organization?
Yeah, I think we've got a very different list of things that we need to start thinking about. And we are facilitators of learning. We always have been. You can't make someone learn. You can only facilitate the environment where someone will learn. So I think these are areas in which we've got to think through how we now move into a kind of facilitation mode. So the roles, without doubt, are changing. And as I go around, and I've got a privilege to do this, and go and look in organisations, you will see that learning functions are beginning to change the way they do things now. So, for instance, in our own team here, the last two positions that we've recruited to, one is digital asset creator. We'd have never even thought we needed a digital asset creator a few years ago, but now we suddenly realise that to create great videos and podcasts and all these kind of things. So, and we're now recruiting for community managers, because we've suddenly realised that if you're going to have effective communities, they just, they need help and support and gardening and all these kind of things. So I think, we are changing the kind of roles and the things that we're doing. So we all hang on to the stuff we enjoy. And I think one of the problems for us as L&D professionals, we do get huge value out of the design and the delivery bit. It's part of our vocation. It's part of our DNA. And, if you went to a chef and said, actually, you can't cook so much now, the chef would probably really struggle with that because that's what they love doing. We've got to recognise it's not what we love doing, it's what the organisation needs. And I think there is a progression now. To some of those new things. But for me, what's really exciting about this is when we begin to get hold of these things about how do we support brilliant communities. The self-direction thing, I think, is absolutely fundamental to this. We are talking about more self-directed learners. The evidence shows that learners who are self-directed are much more personally effective. And if you want a genuine learning organisation, you need to build this self-direction in. But that means we need to change what we do. And as learning professionals, this is about helping learners to relearn how they learn. It's a meta thing. We need to support people in learning. We need to engage line managers. If nothing else, in writing so many of the chapters in the book, you suddenly realise line managers are crucial in this. It's not another thing to stack on their busy list, but if we're going to develop people, we need to do that. So I think our role is shifting, and I actually find this incredibly exciting because I now would rather be around some of these really exciting ways of delivering learning in the moment rather than just sitting there writing courses or e-learning. I mean, how about that? Jeepers. I've got my own track history, and I apologise publicly for some of the e-learning I've designed in the past. But we need to move away from that stuff to some of the really exciting ways we can help people develop.
It's it does require a shift though, and I think there might be a lot of L&D professionals who are hearing these messages and they're getting worried that, right, okay, what does that mean? Because as you say, there's not just the bits in terms of the things that I enjoy, but also like that's where my skill set lies at the moment. I've not read in depth enough of the book. I've put my hands up. I've skimmed through Andy's book and then I've gone in depth into some of the different sections. But to what extent is it a case of, look, we're just going to have to either start reskilling, right? We're going to have to start learning some new stuff, or does it require new people coming into the profession that've got a fundamentally different skill set, and actually some of the roles that are there at the moment are just going to go away?
Yeah, towards at the end of the book, there's a couple of sections. One about how learning is transforming and the team we might need around this, and that's where I can see that some of the trends now coming, and we'll just revisit that in a second. But also it's a mindset change. So for me, it's transforming roles and transforming mindsets. There is a mindset change around this. Now, I came up with, 6 load-bearing pillars on the kind of the L&D function. There we go, as a model. But I'm trying to rationalize this guy. We're trying to work this one out. So for me, I'd got 3 things. Directing. You need vision around this. So someone's going to have to direct what this looks like. And that's your chief learning officers, your head of learning, those kind of things. But there is a diagnostic piece which needs to be sharpened, and learning needs analysis is not doing that. So we now need to have far more kind of performance consulting, those kind of things. So diagnostics is something we can do. That's about having great conversations. That's not a whole new skill set. Designing and delivering are the next 2 Ds. We're quite good at doing that, but we need to recognise that we've got to design more around digital, design around communities, those kind of things. Where I think we are going to have some interesting things, the last 2 are deploying and detecting. Now, on detecting, there is no doubt that data is going to play a bigger part in this, and we know that's the case. Will the average learning and development team be able to have their own data analyst? Probably not. So I guess one of the things I'm couching here in the thinking is that I think that in the L&D teams of the future, there's going to be a core learning gang who do some of this stuff. But then we're going to have, we talk about the gig economy, we're going to have people who support us, and they might be elsewhere in the organisation. We might need marketing to support us in deployment by doing great campaigns or data analysis. So I think there are new roles, but this does not render us without jobs. We just need to think about how our passion and our underpinning understanding of learning now is played out in slightly different ways. And again, that's exactly what the book is all about. 350 odd pages. Sitting there late at night thinking this through, because we can make this transition. And for people listening to this, guys, if you're in a traditional learning function, you can absolutely do this, but it's about mindset change primarily and thinking about other roles that we might need to embrace.
And I think the other thing to emphasize is that, there is an exciting opportunity here because this stuff is being worked out in real time. I can't think, or I would say there's not many learning functions out there that are just coasting along and have got it all absolutely sorted. I think, there's certain learning functions that are really good in some areas and not in others. But, it is genuinely an opportunity for us to learn and figure things out. And so if you're starting to look at some of the areas that you're highlighting, now, then, you're, if not ahead of the curve, you're at least on the curve. You're not behind it. So, getting involved and starting to think about this stuff and starting to try out some new things and start to put some of these new approaches into practice, is the best way of reskilling yourself.
Yeah, and I think you're absolutely spot on that if you're looking for practice, you're seeing pockets of great practice in different organisations. So I guess what I've been able to do with driving performance through learning is go and drag some of that stuff into one place where we can look at that. So I think you're absolutely right. But for me, I mean, just scouting very quickly through, the essential foundations are about diagnosing needs, tracking impact, and designing responsively. That's what I think is underpinning this. Now, we've got to get to a place where we can do that. But some of the new ways, I mean, digital, I think the smartphone, the smart device is the key in this one. Logging on to an old-style LMS, we know this stuff is not driving change, but we know that our lives are changed through smartphones. So I think there's a huge potential to be able to leverage things like smartphone technology, social communities, curation. I still think this is in the mix, even though there's some discussions around whether curation is gone or is relevant. I think with digital content, we really need to think about those things. So, and the other one, just to throw in, is coaching as well. I mean, peer coaching. I mean, all of us have had peer coaches and buddies, so we now need to look, how do we support that? So I think this is really doable. We just need to think slightly differently, and our organisations will be better for having learning delivered in the workplace, in the flow of work, rather than our old traditional approach of sending people on courses. It's got to be the way to go.
Yeah, and the only other thing I would add is I take my hat off to you, Andy, for the book. It is incredibly well referenced, and as I've mentioned before, it covers off all the models that you would possibly need in a whole range of different areas to get started with some of this stuff. And even, some of them were new to me, and I like to think that I keep on top of this stuff. But for example, when you were looking at the responsive learning design, I hadn't realized that the SAM model, successive approximation model, I think it is, had been superseded by SAM 2. That was a brand new one on me. I didn't even realize that there had been an update. So I genuinely, irrespective of how well briefed you feel you are, I am pretty certain that there's going to be something for you in there to think about and add to your mental collection of tools.
Thank you. Yep. So, driving performance through learning. That's 9 months of my life, or my evenings, and very happy to connect with people.
Where can people find it?
Yep, so it's available through Kogan Page. So Kogan Page website. There's a direct link into there. So driving performance through learning. Subtitle: Develop employees through effective workplace learning via Kogan Page, and I think we've got some initial promotions going on, so I'll speak to you guys about that to support folks who might want to buy the book. We can embed a link perhaps with the podcast for those.
Yeah, we can put a link to that in the show notes. Okay, so we'll move on now to our regular feature, What I Learned This Week, where we each share something we picked up in the past 7 days. Owen, do you want to get us started?
Sure thing. So basketball season is upon us. Hooray! I hear everyone say. So I'm a mad keen fan of NBA basketball. And there's two things. I mean, I like watching it in and of itself anyway, but I also like the statistics that lie in behind it. And there is an unbelievable amount of statistics, to gauge, how much influence players have on different teams and who's playing well and who's not playing well, etc. And it's got quite a long history. But there's a piece in 538. They have produced a new statistical metric. And essentially what they said was, look, we've been using the same metrics for such a long period of time, and yet the amount of data that we're collecting during games has increased dramatically. So if we were to start again from scratch and create a metric that allowed us to look at both team and individual player effectiveness, what would that look like, taking into consideration all these new data points? And they have done exactly that. And so there's a really interesting sort of in-depth piece around how they constructed it. But the thing that struck me was, to what extent are we doing this in the workplace now? Because the amount of data that we're collecting is increasing, and yet in a lot of ways, the metrics that we're using to measure performance are really quite crude. We're not doing it particularly well. And I think what that piece in 538 shows is that it is possible to create performance metrics that that factor in new data and provide you with a much deeper level of insight than you ever had before. And I guess my kind of question is, what is stopping us from doing that in the workplace? Or maybe it's not worthwhile. I mean, after all, these basketball teams are sort of, billion-dollar franchises. But at the same time, I can't help but feel we're much better at measuring performance in sport than we are in the workplace. And for anyone who might think, well, that's just because it's easier to measure performance in sport, I can tell you, measuring the effectiveness of an individual player on a basketball team is an incredibly hard thing to do. And yet, this team have managed to do that in a way that I think is incredibly compelling.
Is that partly just because they're able to observe? They have all this data, they're able to observe the players in the flow of work effectively, so they can see every pass they make. They have a visual record of every shot that they make and can calculate from that the sort of percentage success rate.
Yeah, so there's an element of that. But if you think about how difficult is it to create a metric, a statistic that's based on a player taking a shot and how hard that shot was and how close players were in proximity to them. So, like, not only, I mean, they've gone about things in terms of, let's start collecting more data, and then they've looked at it and said, how can we use that data to infer the actual levels of performance and the values of these individual players? So, I don't think it's just because it's easier to see how they're doing. They've had to think about, how do we start capturing more meaningful data based on the position in the court, the position of the players that are surrounding them, time left on the clock, the shot clock, all these kind of different things, and come up with really quite sophisticated statistics around that. And I just can't help but feel that it should be more possible to do that in various different aspects of work.
Out of interest, do you have a pick for the season? What team is...
well, I'm going to be quite boring because I think...
And choose 538s.
Yeah. Well, actually, I can't remember which one they've got, but the LA Clippers look... they've got a phenomenal team, and they've got... the trades they made in the off-season look like, I think they're the ones to beat.
Very good. Well, we'll post a link to that article in our show notes. Andy, what did you learn this week?
Yeah, well, I'm only 5'6", so I'm not going to go anywhere near basketball. But you know, on a bizarre thing, I have a health-related stats. What I've learned this week. So, I'll admit it publicly on the podcast. I'm trying to lose a bit of weight at the moment. It kind of comes to us all, and I'm on an app at the minute which is doing all sorts of interesting things like tracking my numbers of steps, but it's looking at my calorie count, and I've found some staggering calorie information which I'm going to give you, which I've learnt this week. So, do you know which is more healthy, half a cup of grapes or half a cup of raisins? So, what do you reckon? Half a cup of grapes or half a cup of raisins in terms of calories? Putting you on the spot, guys.
I would say half a cup of raisins.
It's
same
healthier.
amount of sugar, but more densely packed. No, half a cup of raisins have more calories.
that's why you're in the position you're in, Owen, because you're absolutely right. Do you know, half a cup of grapes is 30 calories. Half a cup of raisins is 220 calories, 7 times more. So I guess what I've learnt this week is, even though something might be from the same derivation, boy, can it be different. And the other one, as we head into a big rugby game, I don't want to say too much about that one because obviously England are doing incredibly well. Do you know a pint of stout has third the calories of a pint of vintage cider. So I guess my thing I've learnt this week is that, do you know what is the stats thing again? So the stats sometimes are staggering if you take time to analyse them. So make sure you do analyse the stats. And this little app is bringing some real eye-openers for me. So, yep, guys, grapes, not raisins.
I can see you sitting there watching the rugby with your bowl of grapes and your pint of stout.
Yes, don't you know it? So no, that's fine. So, but yeah, sometimes what was really interesting for me on this one, this is a socialised community again. This is a global community on this app, and it really has helped because you're having conversations with people who are doing the same thing. So coming back to social learning and stuff, being hooked in and connected with people really helps. So maybe I guess the other encouragement out of this, guys, is we all need to make sure we're in networks of practice because it really does make a massive difference.
So what I learned this week is something I picked up from the Slate Political Gabfest podcast, whose cocktail chatter segment bears an uncanny but entirely coincidental resemblance to what I learned this week. So I learned about this political experiment called America in One Room, which saw 526 people from across the United States, supposedly the most representative sample of the American electorate that has ever been assembled. Spent 3 days discussing issues that are relevant to them or of concern to them in the 2020 presidential election, things like immigration, healthcare, the economy, etc. And the participants were asked to complete a survey before the experiment and after the experiment, and the results were compared. And what they showed were that while people generally didn't change their views, so Republicans didn't come out identifying as Democrats and vice versa, they generally, at the end of the 3 days, felt more warmly towards their people who held opposing views, and they also felt generally more positive about democracy and their political institutions in general. And I thought it was interesting because it sort of flies in the face a little bit of the received wisdom about how politics in America, but also globally, is becoming more and more polarized. We're segregated geographically, but also in terms of the media that we consume. But actually, when you get these people in one room, people are actually still able to have a civil conversation and exchange ideas and be persuaded. I don't know if it necessarily has many applications outside of that particular experiment, but I thought it was interesting nonetheless. And that is all for this week. If you'd like to share your thoughts on the show, you can find us all on Twitter. You can tweet me at @Ross_Dickie. You can tweet Owen
at Owen Ferguson.
And you can tweet Andy
at Andy Lancaster UK, and the book via Kogan page.
You can also get in touch with us at GoodPractice or at GoodPractice AUS. For more from us, including details of our performance support toolkit and our back catalogue of podcasts, visit goodpractice.com. Finally, if you've enjoyed this conversation, why not tell someone about it, either in person or by leaving a review on iTunes. Thanks for listening. Bye for now.
So I just listened to your episode. It was good, but bit of feedback.
Go on.
Bit of feedback. Your What I Learned This Week has already been covered 3 weeks ago on the Joe Marks Messengers podcast, which was excellent, and you've obviously missed it.
I'm not quite sure how that happened. Although I do remember thinking at the time that Owen was suspiciously quiet after hearing my What I Learned This Week. Particularly because, you know, it's American politics, political gabfest, which he likes, data. It seemed like the sort of topic that should be right up Owen's street, but he didn't say anything. This might explain it.
Or he fell asleep because he'd heard it better described earlier.
I guess we'll let the listeners be the judge of that.